Hello, everyone. This is Derek with Bobble Crow Publications. Coming back today with, we're going to do another art demo here. And today I actually wanted to talk a little bit about process. I had mentioned in a previous video that we were going to be talking about some art process, and so here it is today. A little bit about that. This is a page from our upcoming story, After, at least the first issue of After. This is the main character from that story. His name's Dante, and this is him sort of asleep on the shores of Acheron. He's about to wake up in part of the afterlife. And so today, what I'm going to be doing is, mostly this is going to be an inking demo, but I wanted to sort of show you how I put a page together and talk a little bit about the tools that I use to make that work. So let me grab something here. The first part of this process is actually the layouts. And so what I like to do is I make a book. This is just legal size paper folded over, because this is the size of our finished publications. And I draw out each panel as it would appear on each page, and I do a little bit of lettering, sort of preliminary lettering. This is kind of the first draft. You can think of this as the first draft of the script. And then as I kind of work on developing the story, more drafts happen, and things get a little more detailed, a little more worked out as I go along. I make some changes, that kind of thing. But yeah, for the most part, I like to have a really solid sort of layout of what I'm going to be up to. And once that is done, I hit the some Bristol board here, and I'm going to show you. I've used all kinds of stuff. I used multimedia board for a long time, and that works fine. I've used some other brands of Bristol board. I found this stuff kind of recently. This is the Canson Bristol, and it's a little bit thicker. It's acid free. It's got a nice kind of tooth to it. It's the vellum texture, and so I've been using that. It's a little bit more expensive, but I found that it makes a much nicer line. It takes the pen better, and takes the ink a lot better. It absorbs it, so you get a much darker black, much more solid black for your inks. And then so I got the Bristol board, and then I've actually been penciling in these guys here. This is actually just a correction pencil. You can buy these at like a grocery store or office supply store, pretty much anywhere. I like them because what I do is I can just get crazy with the drawing and detailed and messy and kind of leave in all of my pencil strokes. Later on in Photoshop, I just take out the red and it just leaves the black ink, and so I don't have to worry about erasing, which for me at least has always been problematic, because I have found that when I go to erase stuff, it tends to peel up a little bit of the ink if you're not careful, or you have to spend a lot of time carefully sort of erasing around what you've inked. And so this is kind of a time-saving tool, and also I like kind of it makes a thicker line, and that sort of forces me to really sort of think about my shapes and my lines, because I don't have a lot of refinement. I just making kind of this thick pencil line. Anyway, so red pencil for the pencils, and then what I ink with, generally speaking, is got one of these guys. These are the G-sized pen nib for a Crowquill pen, and I actually had to order these from Japan. This is what they use for manga, and it's a Nico G. So they're from Nico, and it's the G size tip, and this was a game changer for me. Up until recently, I had used some other nibs, and they were cheaper, and that was great, but they did not make a nice enough line, or nearly as nice a line, and had to end up doing a lot of work to remake the lines and make sure they didn't spatter and that kind of stuff. The other thing I have been using a lot more of recently is a brush, and I use the brush mostly just for fill. So these blacks, the shadows and the spot blacks and that kind of thing, well, you'll see that here in a bit. I've been using a brush to kind of fill those in. And again, you know, these are more expensive too, but I have found that getting, you know, you can make it just about anything work, right, for art supplies, and so you don't have to buy a super fancy pen or super fancy brushes or anything, but it helps because in the long run, you can be less careful about what you're doing, and you have to make, you know, fewer repairs to your art. So it's kind of a time saver. You get higher quality art faster. At least that's what I found. The one thing that I am using that is still kind of cheap, but I have a lot of it, so I'm just trying to use it up. But I've been using the Speedball ink, and this stuff is not best. I mean, it's India ink, which is really great, generally, kind of ink. But this particular brand is pretty mediocre. At least I haven't been super impressed with it, but I just have so much, I haven't been able to let it go. So, you know, once I run out of this, I'm going to find a better ink. All right. Then I've got a liner pen here. This is a Pentel, I believe, as a poster pen. Yeah, Pentel pen, poster pen. I love these for just doing the borders on my panels. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started here with that. Alright, we got a border. Now we can start working on this big old face here. Here's the tricky part, is thinking about where you want to start, especially with inking. General rule is that you want to ink sort of away from your hand. If you're like me, some people are really good at being at their technique and can do a lot of work without putting their hand on the board, which is fantastic, but that is not me. I am very much a heavy-handed, kind of drag my hand across the board, so I have to be careful. So the trick for me is to work away from my hand, so start up here and always have my hand sort of coming away from the artwork. And for me, while I'm inking, my natural tendency is to kind of pull down, so there'll be a lot of rotation of the artwork here, just to sort of accommodate for that. Try to do it as little as possible, but just kind of the way it is for me. and that's all right. Having your own sort of way of doing things is not necessarily bad. Just got to figure out how to make it work, basically. One thing with inking too is, especially with the quill pen and a brush, there you have the pen nib bends, and so you get this nice sort of variable line. But if your lines become sort of segmented and a little short, what can happen is you get this sort of bubbly line that goes from thick to thin to thick to thin, kind of back and forth, and that's all right, but it can get away from sort of the I don't know how to describe it. Get away from sort of the realism in the drawing or readability when you have this sort of bumpy line. But the other flip side of that, of course, is that you get this really nice, beautiful line that has a lot of character and sort of artistry to it with this, tool set, pen nibs and brushes. So as you probably notice here, this first page is a large, I would say almost life-size, maybe larger than life-size illustration of a face. And I kind of wanted, normally, I don't know, you wouldn't necessarily start a comic story with just a big old face for the readers to come across, but I really wanted, each issue of After is about a person who passes on, and everything that you see in the story is sort of based on who that person is, who they were, what happened to them in their lives, and just all these, very sort of personal things. And so I thought, at least with Dante here in this first story, that'd be really interesting, to show him in this kind of intimate, kind of vulnerable way almost. He's asleep. We're just sort of staring at him. And I thought it'd be, give the reader sort of a whole page to get acquainted with this person, and on a very sort of intimate level, and hopefully sort of develop some empathy, some, identity with this person, as a character, and as sort of the main driving force of the story. And so that's why I've got this, this illustration here of this man's face, and we're right close up on it, and it's going to have a lot of detail here, as you can see in the hair. I'm doing all the hair follicles, and gonna, the eyebrows, the eyelashes, all the little wrinkles in the face, just all this stuff. The other way to kind of look at this is as sort of, this is our opening shot. A lot of opening shots are a landscape. And I thought it would be interesting to, instead of a landscape, have sort of face as landscape. So you have, the story is, like I said, the person creates, the person that goes into Acheron, which is where these stories take place, they sort of, to an extent, create what's there in Acheron while they are there. And I thought it'd be interesting to sort of have this introductory quote-unquote landscape, which is a face, but with all the details, that you would see in, or the level of detail you would see in a landscape, level of information, but on a face instead. So it's kind of this, I don't know if you've ever heard of Chuck Close, but he's a painter, and it's actually funny. He's somebody with face blindness, which means he can't recognize people based on looking at their faces, but he paints faces, and he paints them as landscapes. And so I think I'm drawing a little bit from that, sort of thinking of a person as a whole place, almost, right? Like, instead of just being a person, here in Acheron, their personage sort of expands into becoming, the whole world of Acheron, right? Because it's their version of the afterlife, or at least the afterlife gets built up around what they bring with them. So, lots and lots of hair follicles and little details, which I love. Actually, I'm a huge sort of detail junkie, so like all this stuff is fascinating to me. The texture of different people's hair and how it's formed, and gonna get into the sort of the grass and the rocks here and all that stuff. I feel like you can get a lot of narrative out of just these little details if you get enough of them in there, and if they're sort of relevant to what you're talking about in your story. You can do a lot of storytelling with these weird little things. And I do love drawing hair. I don't know. A lot of artists, I think, aren't that into it, but I've always, I think once I never was that into it, and then as a very young artist, I figured out just, some pretty decent techniques for it. And once that happened, it just sort of opened up this whole world of texture and detail to me that I thought was fascinating. Plus, I'm a bald guy, so I think that might have something to do with it too. Living vicariously through my character's awesome hair. Sorry, I just realized I'm not paying too much attention to where the camera's pointing here. Sorry about that. One kind of hard lesson I had learned with quill pens is that you just have to accept that you're going to be dipping into the inkwell a lot they just, you know, they hold the ink on the tip of the pen, and that's it. So you're just gonna have to refill a whole bunch. When I was first starting out with this stuff, I was constantly frustrated because I was just like, why won't this hold, you know, 20 minutes worth of ink? And it just doesn't. But that's okay now. It's part of the meditative process. So inking is, I think most comic artists will tell you this, is pretty much the best part of doing comics art. And I think it's because, well, on one hand, it's sort of relaxing, and it's just, you know, going over your drawing and making sort of fun lines and textures, and there's a lot less pressure. You know, it's a lot more, in a lot of ways, a lot more forgiving than a drawing. A drawing, you've got to set everything up and make it all work and look accurate and all that stuff. But the other thing that I think that happens when you're inking is that, you know, this is the finished image, and so suddenly everything starts to make sense, and your drawing that was just a bunch of sort of rough lines and marks, and you know, you can see all the structure lines and all that stuff. Once you get to the inking stage, everything starts to make more sense, and there's this sort of catharsis that happens with that, where, you know, you're looking at it and it's like, oh yeah, you know, because, you know, Dante's hair, you know, the drawings, you know, I'm not going to draw in all this detail because I can just ink it in. So the drawings for the hair are just sort of these kind of columns, you know, little mini columns with a rounded top, and which just looks weird until you ink it, but when you ink it, then suddenly everything is making sense and falling into place, and it's pretty interesting. The other thing about inking too is, you know, sort of to go back to what I just said was, you know, this is where all of your hard work kind of pays off. You know, I was showing you the layout book earlier, and I've got, you know, a bunch of design sketches and just sort of all this work that went into figuring out how I'm gonna make this character come to life. And you get to this inking stage, and it's the final step in that whole process. And so suddenly you went from all these sketches to, you know, all this sort of the rough versions of this character, now to this fully realized, you know, actualization of this character on the page, and it's a pretty cool feeling. And this is a lot of detail, of course, because, you know, because it's a close-up. The rest of the illustrations of Dante won't be quite this detailed. And the strategy here is to sort of paint the picture of this character in the beginning and give the reader all these little details and kind of let him really absorb the character, so that when they read the rest of the story, this is at least hopefully what they see when they look at Dante. They see all of this, sort of these details and all these little characteristics that make him who he is. So it's a lot of work up front, but hopefully it'll pay off in the rest of the story. You know, it's kind of like an established, like I was saying earlier, kind of about the landscape comparison. It's sort of this establishing shot that sets the scene. And the scene in this case, because this is, you know, Acheron and the afterlife and all that, is Dante. He's the whole, sort of, he's the main character, but also in a way sort of the setting for the story. So we're setting the scene by taking such a close look at Dante. Okay, so for right now, it's going to be enough on the pen. I'll come back to that. Now we're going to move on to some brush work. And I'm going to be doing, I'm going to start with a bunch of fill. So I've got this method that I use for I guess mainly for doing sort of nature scenes and natural details and that kind of thing, but I use it for other stuff as well, where I fill in some positive space, so that's a bunch of black, and then I come back over that with, I have some white ink, I'll show you that here in a minute, but I come back over that with the white ink and do in details and highlights and that kind of thing. So to start with, we're going to grab our number 5 here and charge up the brush there and start filling in these blacks. And I find it's best to sort of get an outline first and then kind of fill in between there. I think this is sort of subconsciously the most gratifying type of inking for me, is just this laying down all this black ink with the brush, just because it goes on nice and smooth and it's real easy. And when you've got these all this really positive space, all this sort of, they call it spot black, built up, it really starts to look, I don't know, it looks comic booky, I guess. It's really sort of gratifying in that way. This is actually kind of a newer style for me. I generally love to, like I did with all this hair here, I love to render, or used to. I think I'm less interested in it now, just want to get the work done, but I used to love to spend the time filling in all the details and making a lot of values and tones with hatching marks and textures and all that kind of stuff. And I never really resorted to using a lot of black, but I found recently and not only does it go a lot faster to do it this way, but you get a lot of really beautiful forms and shapes, and you know, and your reader, you know, whoever's reading your book is reading it, right? So, you know, sometimes the detail is necessary and you want to put a lot of it in. Like in this page here, there's going to be a lot of detail, but you know, they're reading it, and so you don't want to stick your reader with a whole lot of detail to look at for no reason. I mean, apart from, you know, you just really like to draw detail, right? So focusing on this more sort of graphic approach where you've got, you know, leaning a little bit more heavily on just black and just white, just positive and just negative space, makes it a little bit easier to read and to sort of take in each illustration rather than taking in, you know, a whole lot of detail and trying to work that out. If you can see this, I was talking about having cheap ink earlier. This is where you can really see it. You see it kind of getting sort of muddy towards the edges. So I gotta spend a little more time going over it, making sure it's a solid black. But it really, you know, honestly, once I get it into Photoshop, I do a correction on the tones and the blacks anyway, so I make everything, it kind of nullifies all that. So you probably notice here, I drew a bunch of, these are blades of grass, and now I'm kind of covering them up. It's going to become apparent here in just a bit what I'm up to. Hopefully it'll become apparent. This is sort of a method I have, like I said, with drawing natural stuff. Is I'll start in with the black, and then we'll get some details and highlights with the white ink. So the nice thing about working with India ink, and you may not be able to see it on the video here, but India ink, just in general, even if it's the cheap stuff, is still quite thick, and so what I'll be able to do is it gives you this sort of embossed edge on things that you've drawn before, if you are inked before, if you ink a second layer over that. So I'll kind of, that catches the light a little bit, and I'll be able to follow that when I come back through with the white. Helps a bit. And this is, I don't don't know, this is just kind of my technique. It's not maybe the best way to do it, but I really like how it looks. So yeah, so I kind of have stuck with it. It's also kind of a newer technique, really, with the white ink for me. So still something that I'm kind of experimenting with, seeing what I can do with it. This page, for instance, will actually be kind of pushing it because it's, you know, we have a whole clump of grass here, and yeah, we'll see how well the ink lays down. Alrighty, so there we have it. Page 1 of our first after storyline about our friend Dante here. And yeah, pretty happy with how that turned out. Might do a little bit of touching up here and there, add some lines, fix some things, but otherwise, yeah, looking pretty good. Thanks for watching today, and hopefully we'll see you soon.